that there's a big story emerging, and that is the potential closure, possibly we're being told, of hundreds of schools because they were built back in the 70s with this sort of, you know, concrete answer to Aero chocolate bars, so lots and lots of bubbles in them, and this isn't safe apparently. And now schools are potentially all going to be shut. Kids will not be able to go back to school because their schools are unsafe to be in. Let's talk to, very pleased to be joined by Schools Minister Nick Gibb. Good morning, Nick.
Good morning, Kevin.
Well, this is a very alarming story, is it not? Now, so far as I understand it, the government's not telling us how many schools might be shut down, but the Sun is saying it may be as many as 150, maybe even more. Now, that would involve possibly 100,000 kids, maybe more. First of all, how many schools do you feel will be closed down, will have to close because of this aerated concrete problem?
It won't be that many. It will be a small number of the 156. So in 156 schools, because of the survey work we've been doing since 2022, we know that they have confirmed RAC in those 156 schools. In 52 of them, we've already taken action, and the children are back in face-to-face education, in alternative accommodation, or repairs have been made to the school. In the other 104, we have, where we know they have RAC, but we had thought that RAC was safe to leave and for pupils to be taught in those particular schools.
Could you explain what RAC is?
Yes, reinforced, aerated, autoclaved concrete.
Got it.
This is the bubbly concrete that you were talking about.
I didn't realise that it had a name, but carry on.
That's the acronym for it, RAAC.
Got it. Yep.
And so in those 104 schools, we now think that the RAC that isn't critical, but we now think that despite not being critical, we do now think, given evidence that emerged over the summer, that those rooms or classrooms or buildings are no longer, if you're taking a very cautious approach, which we are no longer safe, and we're asking schools to find alternative accommodation for those particular rooms or buildings. It won't necessarily be the whole school. It depends how extensive the RAC is in the particular school. But we take safety first, and that's why we have changed the guidance yesterday to schools to say that they need to find alternative accommodation for those rooms.
There are reports that the government was warned about this 5 years ago. Funny enough, or rather extraordinarily, I would say, there have been 7 education secretaries since 2018. Why is it only now, Nick, that action is being taken if the government was warned 5 years ago that there are serious safety concerns? Why suddenly now, just ahead of the terms?
Yeah. What's happening now is a change of guidance because of new evidence. We have been taking action since 2018. We issued a warning notice to schools in 2018. We've had guidance to schools in 2021, and in 2022 we started surveying more than any other government around the world, surveying all 22,500 schools, asking them if they can identify whether or not they have RAC. We've looked at those surveys, and the vast majority confirm they don't have RAC. In fact, half the schools were built outside the RAC period in our school estate. And then we've sent surveyors in to identify if they do in fact have RAC. Most did not, but some did. And we know that because of that survey work, we know that 156 schools have RAC. And we now need to go one step further and say RAC that we thought was safe, we now want to take those particular buildings out of action, out of use.
Nick, can you explain or can you tell us what the RAC period was? What is the time frame there? When did they start building schools with this material, and when did they end?
It started in about the 1950s and it ended in the mid-90s. So but most of it was built in the 60s and 70s. But as I say, it's a very small proportion of schools across the system. 156 schools we're talking about right now, where we have RAC confirmed, out of 22,500 schools. We're still doing a little bit more survey work, and where those surveys indicate there might be a presence of rack, we're sending in surveyors straight away to confirm whether or not it has been. And our experience so far is that when those surveys come back, the vast majority say no rack, and even when they suspect it, the majority don't actually have rack when we send the surveyors in.
And what is this new evidence that has brought about this urgent situation then? What is the new evidence that has caused you to at least consider closing even some schools?
Over the summer, there were a number of incidents in schools and in non-schools, commercial buildings, in this country and outside this country. We've been very proactive in rooting out this evidence and keeping close to it, that showed that rack that we thought was not critical actually can also is also unsafe, and that's the new evidence that has emerged. And it's because of that, over the summer, we took the very difficult decision to change the guidance to say you had to take out of use buildings with rack, even if it's not in a critical condition. And that's because we're being very abundantly cautious in terms of safety of children and pupils in our schools. And that's the work that we've been doing today with schools. Every school in those 156 will have a caseworker to find alternative accommodation if necessary, or to put in propping or other measures to keep the school safe.
The Telegraph today is categorising this as the lockdowns all over again, kids not being able to go to school, missing out on their education. Will some kids not be able to go to school because of this? And if so, will they return to online learning like they did during the COVID crisis?
In some instances, for a very short time, that might be necessary while the school arranges alternative accommodation. We've already done this in 52 schools, and the average time out of face-to-face education was about 6 days on average. We want that to be even less. But it does depend on how much rack is in a school. It might just be in a cupboard, it might be in 1 or 2 rooms, but if it's more extensive, then this whole school may have to close in a small number of cases. And we'll have alternative accommodation, maybe porta cabins being installed while we repair or rebuild the school.
Nick Gibb, Schools Minister, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for joining us. That was Nick Gibb, Schools Minister there, about this extraordinary story.